Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm joined by Carl.
Hello.
And I am Josh. And today we are going to be talking about the debate between free will and determinism. My position is that free will is an illusion and it doesn't really exist. However, that doesn't change anything about morality or that choices still matter.
My position is that you believe in this illusion.
Sure.
And that it does change things if we didn't have free will.
And first and foremost, I'd like to say that I actually kind of defended free will for a very long time before I changed my mind about it. And it was going into university, for example, I kind of clung on to the notion for about 2 years, despite it being one of the things that I really focused on kind of developing my knowledge of. And I kind of obsessed over it because I saw if free will didn't exist, then surely then none of our actions have consequence. Nothing really matters. You can't be a moral, good person. Yeah. And I came to realise that that's actually not the case. And I'm not going to be arguing that morality doesn't exist and that people should be let off for bad things they've done or things like that. That's not what determinism is all about.
Aren't you?
No, because
if everything is deterministic, then do we get a choice in the actions we take? And if we don't get a choice in the actions we take, on what grounds do we morally judge people for the choices they make?
Well, if things are still determined, you still have choices, right? And
I don't know. It sounds like a contradiction to me.
No, because you're posed with a choice, but determinism would, or people who argue in favour of determinism would suggest that both your genes or your biology and your environment, the world around you, shape who you are as a person to the extent that even if it feels like you have a choice, you're already predisposed to a certain preference, because it would be very difficult to have preferences. You don't come to any choice by completely blank, otherwise you wouldn't be able to make a choice in the first place.
So can we lay out the thesis of what determinism is? So because I'm actually not very clear on what the exact thing that determinists believe is.
It's essentially the argument that who we are as a person is determined by our genes, our biology, and our environment. And these things affect our future behaviours, but it's more or less a cause and effect argument. You have these certain conditions that are dictated by things outside of your control, and this shapes your subsequent behaviour in the future. And although you feel like you have a certain amount of agency, and I mean, how you define agency depends on how you want to look at it, but although you feel like you are the author of your own thoughts, they appear automatically in your head. You don't sit there and think, okay, I'm going to think this next thing, and then you think it, because by kind of
you?
As in you don't if you think you're going to have if you think you're going to have a thought in the future, you've already thought it in the present, right? It's a fallacy to know what you're going to think in the future.
Yeah, I can't predict what my future thoughts are going to be, but I can choose to think about X.
But that's not inconsistent with determinism. You can direct your attention to certain thoughts. That's not inconsistent with the deterministic.
But the deterministic thesis surely says it's not really my choice that I choose to direct my thoughts in a certain way, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by choice. I think.
Well, this is I've studied the philosophical argument of free will, and this is one of Peter Strawson's complaints. It's like no one seems to be able to adequately define what the thesis of determinism is, and he claims himself not to understand it because it's kind of vague.
Well, I think it's because it's come from the psychological sciences largely, because it comes from an understanding of human nature and the brain, and therefore it's not necessarily a thesis that has been kind of top-down developed. It's more a gradual realization, because in the past, when our understanding of psychology was perhaps less developed, I think people all assumed that free will was a thing, and it's only since we've gained a better understanding of our own minds that determinism has become more widely accepted.
So how do you define free will?
Okay, so I can tell you which two assumptions it rests on, if that kind of helps things. But
That's a start.
I find it difficult to define something that I don't necessarily believe exists, right? So it's not necessarily...
Come on, that's not fair. I can define what a unicorn is, but I don't believe one exists.
John just said the exact same thing before we started, actually.
It's true.
I suppose it's that you are the author of your own thoughts, and that you choose what you think about, and you're completely independent of the forces exerted on you by both your biology and your environment. That would be perhaps how I would define free will.
Okay.
Although I've come up with that kind of off the cuff, right?
You're not the first person to come up with that. There was a chap called Arthur Schopenhauer who essentially came to the same conclusion, because he asked, well, is the will itself free? And I actually have a note here in exactly what he said. So he was basically trying to establish, is the will free from necessity? And of course, that's not true. You're material. You live in a body. You have various biological pressures put on you. You need food. You need shelter. You need to escape danger, things like that. And doing these things isn't an act that's without necessity, and so you can't really call that free. But that, I don't think, is the question. Because nobody's contesting that. Does the will of a human being reside within the fleshy sack that is the body? Obviously it does. No one's saying that.
Well, I mean, there are people who believe in a soul, and
there are Cartesians who believe in some sort of transcendental and immaterial soul.
And of course, there is the fact that you don't choose your soul, so it's still
that's true.
Tied into the deterministic
if you
framework.
Believe in such a thing.
Yeah.
But if we just say a consciousness to arrive at something that I think we can both agree on,
of course,
soul. I don't think the free will thesis is that the will is detached from the body and independent of the needs of the body. I think the free will thesis is that the consciousness, the rational agent, whose will it is, that it belongs to, is able to make choices that contradict the immediate desires of the body itself. And so, as in, I could say, well, I'm hungry, but and so if I was if I was an animal, all I would do is then spend the next X amount of time looking for food until I found food, then I'd eat the food, and I would have no control over that, like a dog, right? But the thing is, I think that humans aren't like that, and if I'm hungry, I can just choose not to eat, because that's an expression of my free will.
I agree that is something that you can do, that you have a metacognitive capacity to override your biological programming. I think that's...
But that I think is what the free will thesis is.
Okay.
That we have the ability to do that. And so, and it's not predetermined that I will do that. I mean, I might not, it's really about a bunch of character traits that I possess at this point. Sure. And whether I'm going to stick to my diet or whether I'm going to have a donut for breakfast or whatever. And some days I will, some days I won't, depending on how self-controlled I'm feeling, how dedicated to my diet I'm feeling. But again, I think the choice resides in me rather than resides in a necessarily outside factor or within my biological impulses.
Sure. So what a determinist would argue here is that what's shaping your self-control, is what I'm going to call it, in resisting eating when you're hungry, is still informed by factors inside of you, obviously, of course. It's not coming from anywhere else. That's entirely obvious. Yeah. It's coming from your brain. But what has shaped your disposition to that, to take that action, is still shaped by both your biology and your environment. You wouldn't make that choice if you were living in a state of nature, if you hadn't been shaped in that way in which you would want to have this level of control. If you were living as an animal, you don't have that same...
I can think of an example that's not true. When an ancient human is hunting, they've got to exercise a remarkable amount of self-control not to spoil the hunt. And so even though they might be like desperately hungry and everything in their body's telling them, right, just charge at that deer or whatever, they know that if they do that, the deer gets away, so they don't do that. So I don't agree. Again, I think that there is a point between the physical desires that they have and the actions that they take, that there is a rational component, a space there that is where our moral and rational agency is exercised. And I think that we do get to determine that depending on what we see around us, what we think is the best move for us, what we want,
I don't think a determinist would
moral
necessarily
considerations.
deny that. I don't think that's inconsistent with either.
This is why the determinist thesis seems so difficult to pin down, because it's like, okay, but what are you saying then?
Well, it's more or less that we feel like we are the author of our own thoughts, but we don't really choose what we think. We are shaped by forces that are kind of beyond our control. We don't, for example, choose our biology, our genes, which dictates a large amount of how we are predisposed. It can be found to correlate with things like personality, all sorts of different areas. We know it's very significant, and not only that, but of course your environment is, largely influenced by your upbringing. Any developmental psychologist or even psychoanalysts and Freud, and I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of him, but he did get one thing right, that the early childhood is very important for shaping your later life, but you don't choose how to be brought up.
Sure, and I agree that the way you're habituated informs your habits, right? Obviously. But I think that doesn't mean you don't get to have a period of rational decision-making between the point of needing to make a decision and then making that decision.
There's also the idea that decision making is rational, and you've kind of stepped onto something that is my area of expertise. Decision making is the area in which I specialised in. So when it comes to actual decisions, I might go on a little bit of a tangent here. So sorry about that, but you've stepped on something that I'm very interested in.
That's fine.
So with decision making, there's the kind of prevailing theory at the minute, one that's got a reasonable amount of support, whether it's actually true at a neurological level or just as a conceptualization. You have two different kind of decision-making pathways. You have the slow, deliberate, conscious one, where you sit and think about the consequences of your choice. You behave more rationally. You think more about the long-term consequences and the implications. I think most people would admit that is a way of thinking about a decision, but also there's the kind of more unconscious variant in which you don't necessarily think about the decision, you don't take time, it's almost instantaneous.
Consulting your intuitions.
Yes, it is. Intuition is a good way of putting it, because...
And a great example of this, what you had for breakfast this morning. Like you went downstairs, you looked in the cupboards and you had toast or cereal. Which did you feel like? You just had the intuition that, I prefer to have cereal today. It's not necessarily like a well thought out rational decision, but it's still a decision that you chose to make based on desires that you had within you, and you could have chosen the opposite if you'd wanted.
That's pretty much what I would say about it as well, as a determinist. So I think it might be...
Hang on. Okay, but you weren't determined to have cereal.
Well, your preference is dictated by your prior experience, isn't it?
Well, it's also, and by, I assume by, whatever, minerals and vitamins your body feels you need,
so that would be your biology.
But these are pressures, but they don't guarantee that you take a certain action. And if they don't guarantee that you take a certain action, then I don't think you can call that deterministic.
But how do you... At what level are you looking at the scenario here? Because I think when you're approaching something, how could you argue for the free will case in this specific scenario? For example, like why would
scenario of choosing breakfast?
Someone would be like predisposed; they had a certain preference, but yet they still chose something else. Why would that happen?
Because I might have a certain preference for Pop-Tarts, but Pop-Tarts are full of sugar and I want to lose weight.
But that's a preference towards losing weight, though. That's still within your head.
It's not though. I would say sort of biological preference, as in it's not being driven by an immediate biological desire. The immediate biological desire is saying, eat the Pop-Tart, it's delicious. But my rational mind is like, but if I do that, I know what the consequence is going to be. I won't have lost any weight or I'll gain weight. And of course, I don't want to do that for various other reasons that at this point are conceptual, because they're things that are predicted to happen in the future, what I expect to happen. And so I make the decision instead to have oatmeal or whatever it is, to make sure that doesn't happen and that I stay on a particular kind of course. And that I don't think can be considered to be deterministic in any circumstance.
But the fact that you've made a choice and it's informed by a conflict of perhaps your biology, obviously,
Yeah,
you're biologically driven to prefer things like fatty, sugary foods.
Exactly.
But we all understand that to live in the modern world, you have to have some level of self-control and not eat that sort of thing.
Yes.
And I don't see this as being not a deterministic point, because your preference is still informing your decision, and what makes up your preference is your genes and your environment.
Sure, but
ultimately the consequence comes from these two principles, doesn't it?
So this gets to the question of what is it to have free will? What does that mean? And Schopenhauer would say, well, essentially the standard you're setting here is to have a will that is free from the absence of all necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's no external pressures on the will at all. And I don't think anyone, like on the free will side of the argument, would accept that as being the definition, because it's kind of an absurd standard. You know, it's a standard we know can't be achieved, and isn't really what we're talking about, I think, because like nobody thinks that the will can ever be. And in fact, this is what this view of the freedom of the will is, in my opinion, why radical leftism is so insane, because they think, well, I can just change my body to suit my will, and you know. I should never be hungry. I should never be this. I should never be that. The state should provide everything for me. Blah, blah. And that all comes from the presupposition that the will should be unencumbered by necessity at every point, which is just absurd, in my opinion. And I don't think that's reasonably what the free will thesis is. I think the free will thesis begins with the assumption that, of course, we are material creatures and we have material needs. We also have metaphysical, emotional needs and things like that. But we're not separate from the universe. We're contained within it. And I mean, what would a will even wish for if it had no encumbrances on it? You know, the things that drive you isn't the need for love, the need for happiness, the need for food, the need for shelter. These all inform why you do anything, what you're trying to get. You need to be entertained. If you're unencumbered by any of these things, then do you even have a will at all? And if you do have a will, what's the driving force of it even having to make decisions? Because no necessity ever comes up. So why would it ever make a decision at all? And so the idea of the will kind of evaporates into nothingness if there are no outside pressures. So it's totally within the free will thesis that, yes, we live in the world and there are pressures on you that you can't help, but that's not determinism. Determinism is that you don't get a choice in what you do about the pressures that are put on you, and free will says that you do have a choice about what you do.
Well, I don't think determinism denies that you have choices. I mean, choices are still important, obviously. I think outside of this,
we'll get into how the lack of choice destroys morality in a minute. But this is the thing, though. The determinist thesis is very poorly formed, it seems, and I'm still waiting for a good definition.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.